number one, what is the first thing that comes to mind? I would say the inadequacy and unbiblical nature of Sola Scriptura itself. The idea that the only rule of faith for Christians, for the church, that it's the text of Scripture is itself ahistorical and unbiblical. Firstly, because there was no canon of Scripture in the early church. For many centuries, the church, it actually took 6-7 centuries before the church had a rough outline of what the canon would be. And even into the 7th century, one of the great Eastern theologians, one of the first systematic theologian writers, St. John of Damascus, even his canon was different from the rest of the church. But most people don't reject St. John of Damascus. We certainly don't in the Orthodox Church. So if you look at the progression of the formation of the canon itself, you're led to the conclusion that if you're a Protestant, a fallible group of men put together an infallible canon. And that's ultimately nonsense. It's ultimately contradictory. It doesn't work. So what we have here is the assumption of tradition. And tradition comes to us in two forms. There's an oral form and there's a written form. The written form being, of course, the scriptures themselves and the liturgies. And this is something I didn't understand as a Protestant. I didn't understand the importance of the liturgy that even went into the decision as to what books would be included in the canon of Scripture, which again took many, many centuries. So Sola Scriptura is not only unworkable and non-biblical and ahistorical, it's actually easy to refute just from Scripture itself by the fact that there was no New Testament canon. So when you see the New Testament refer to the text, oftentimes it's citing the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? And it never says that the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament is all that's necessary, right? When Paul says that the Scripture is sufficient to make the man of God ready for every work to Timothy, does that mean that there's not going to be, or there's no need for a New Testament canon if he's talking about the Old Testament? Of course not. So when the text of the New Testament themselves include references to extra canonical traditions, as Paul does, he says to the Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians, he says, keep the traditions that you heard from me, whether oral or written. When he tells Timothy to pass on all the things that you heard from me, there are multiple then injunctions to pass on the oral teachings of the apostles as well as the written texts. Some of those written texts we no longer have. They pass away into history. Letters that Paul wrote that we, again, don't have access to anymore. But again, if we think about the fact that for many, many, many centuries during the time of the patriarchs, right, Noah, all the way to Abraham up to Moses, we don't know what that textual history was, if it was even written down. Presumably it was an oral tradition passed down through those families of the righteous, the church of the Old Testament period. And then it becomes codified at the time of Moses. So you had God protecting providentially the oral teachings for many, many, many centuries until Moses. And so if God can providentially do that, then there's nothing that prevents God from providentially doing that after the time of the apostles. And again, we see this injunction in the New Testament itself. And then as we read the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century church fathers themselves, the appointed bishops and priests and presbyters of the church who continued in the succession of the apostles, we see that they also appealed to tradition. They also appealed to tradition for the decision about what would be included in the canon of Scripture and what wouldn't. And so it's absolutely inescapable and impossible. And in fact, when you go to the top Protestant scholars who talk about the decision of the canon of Scripture, the rule of Scripture, they will frequently reference and cite tradition. And they admit that we can't really get around this. For example, how do we know that Matthew, the disciple of Christ, wrote the book of Matthew? We don't, aside from apostolic tradition that's passed down in the church. And so the churches, the different bishoprics can say, we in our bishopric, we accept that gospel over there that we call the Gospel of Matthew to be written in the tradition and from the apostle Matthew. And so that's not everything, but that's one important factor as to what would determine canonicity for something like the Gospel of Matthew. So in other words, the historicity of the church is inescapable for the canon of Scripture.